IVM.
My eyes were burning, stinging. The smoke was really coming through now. Shattered glass everywhere, explosions going off one after the other, non-stop gunfire, water from the broken pipe flooding the floor, the ceiling falling in, and the fire was getting closer. I remember just talking to God, praying, and then getting really angry and thinking, no, God, this is not for me. I'm not going to die hiding under a coffee table at the Taj Hotel. So deal with it. Fix it. I just remember fighting with God and saying, you can't do this to me. This is not my way out. This is not my exit. That was an excerpt from an article in The Guardian by Dalbir Benz. She was inside the Taj Hotel on 26 November 2008, the day when 10 terrorists managed to shake the city of Mumbai to its core. This is the Pragati Podcast, and this week marks 10 years of the 26/11 Mumbai terror attacks. Hi, you're listening to the Pragati Podcast with me, Hamsini Hariharan, and Pavan Srinath. On 26 November 2008, 10 terrorists arrived at Mumbai by sea and attacked the Chhatrapati Shivaji Station, the Taj Hotel, Nariman House, Leopold Cafe, and the Oberoi Trident. Much has been said about the resilience of the city that never sleeps, but no one should ever be forced to go through what the residents of Mumbai went through 10 years ago. How did we let the 26/11 attacks happen? Where did we fail? Have we corrected those failings to ensure India's national security? This is what we're discussing today with our guest, Dheeraj PC. Dheeraj is a doctoral candidate at the University of Leicester, where he covers strategic and military intelligence in South Asia. Before we begin the podcast, I do have a small piece of news. This will be my last episode as the host of the Pragati Podcast. There's more information on that at the end of this episode. But first, a short break.
Hey, it's been another great week on IVM Podcast. If you're not following us on social media, please make sure you do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. This week we have a new history podcast, Echoes of India with Anirudh Kanisetti. The inaugural episode narrates the story of Gandhara, the melting pot of the ancient world where Indo-Greeks worshipped Greco-Indian gods. On Cyrus is joined by Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch. Varun recollects his early days as an intern on MTV Pakra, his many oddball jobs, and his new podcast, Advertising is Dead. Yes, that's right, he has a new podcast. Launching on the 27th, each week Varun will discuss the changes and developments in the business of advertising, branding, content, media, and a whole range of issues that exist within the industry. Episodes are out every Tuesday. On The Scene and the Unseen, Amit Verma is joined by author and journalist Matt Ridley to discuss the evolution of the universe, life, culture, our minds, and our futures. On the Geek Fruit podcast, Tejas and Dinkar slowly lose their mind while they're trying to process just how much they were disappointed by the Fantastic Beasts sequel. Last week on IVM Likes, Abbas and Surbi talk about Homecoming the podcast versus Homecoming the show. Also, we're reaching 100 episodes of IVM Likes soon. Share your favorite moments from the show with us and your most memorable recommendations. You can write to us at shows@indusvox.com. Also, send us a voice note if you can, and we'll play it on the 100th episode. And with that, let's continue on with your show.
Welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. We are your hosts, Hamsini Hariharan and Pavan Srinath, and we're joined by Dheeraj PC.
Hi Dheeraj, welcome to the Pragati Podcast.
Hi Pavan, thank you very much. Pleasure being here.
Dheeraj, we are recording this episode on the anniversary of 26/11, one of the worst terrorist incidents to have happened on Indian soil, if not the worst.
Yes, that's true.
Can you tell us a little about what all happened? Because it's been so many years. Maybe there are some of our listeners who were quite young when it happened. So first give us a recap of what happened and then let's take it from there.
So the idea to have a Mumbai attack was conceived much earlier in say 2006 and 2007 while it was called Operation Bombay, because to understand the 26/11 attack you need to go back to 1993 when the city had witnessed one of the worst serial explosions to ever happen on planet Earth. Yeah. So when that happened, there was a final stage which included armed assault on places like Shiv Sena Bhavan and all those things, which it did not happen. And the simple reason it did not happen was that the terrorists were not very well trained. They were just boys who were into organized crime in Mumbai. And because of this failure, the Pakistani ISI had learned that now we need to carry out an operation which has very little reliance on the local population, local Indian population. So right at that point in time, what had happened was there was a man by the name David Coleman Headley, who was formerly a DIA agent.
DIA is the?
DEA, Drug Enforcement Authority, that's the anti-narcotic intelligence agency in the United States. So he was actually caught in the Frankfurt airport with some amount of drugs. And so he said that he agreed to work with the DEA, and the DEA said that, okay, you can work with us. And they put him back into the Afghan-Pakistan region. And he is also from Pakistani origin. His father was a Pakistani and his mother was an American. So eventually he started to play everybody. And then once, while he was in Pakistan, it struck him that, he could be a valuable asset for the Lashkar-e-Taiba. He wanted to be an active operative, but then his age did not allow that to happen. So what the Lashkar-e-Taiba decided was, look, we've got a smart chap here who looks white, who can blend into the Indian population under the guise of being a Westerner. So we'll use him as an intelligence agent. He will go and he'll recreate all the spots and he'll come back, and then we'll carry out our operations. So what started off as Operation Bombay turned into one of the most horrendous seaborne terrorist attacks that the world has seen till today. So on 26th November, a boat set sail from the port of Karachi, and then they intercepted an Indian boat, which is called Kuber, off the shores of Gujarat. They killed all the crew members, they hijacked it, and then they used that boat to get to the shores of Bombay.
So Dheeraj, this was an operation that was conducted by Pakistan, the putative Pakistani state, which involves the army and the ISI and everyone, right? This is not even originating from Pakistani soil, but away from Pakistani state.
Look, there's only one simple answer to this. That the Lashkar-e-Taiba specializes in Fidaiin attacks can only be attributed to the genius of Pakistani counter-terrorist forces. You have the SSG, the Special Services Group, which is Pakistan's elite counter-terrorist unit. So now when you have a counter-terrorist unit that is training a terrorist group, Lashkar-e-Taiba for instance here, now the counter-terrorist group pretty much knows how the globe is going to respond when there's a terrorist attack. So you see, the terrorist group has every sort of information intelligence that is required in your planning stage. So this attack, the Mumbai attacks of 26/11, was planned and carried out, and not only planned and carried out, there was real-time intelligence flowing from Pakistan. So there's no denying that Pakistan was involved in this.
Okay, so state-sponsored terrorists from the coast of Karachi capture a boat off the coast of Gujarat, and then they come to Bombay. Then what happens?
That's a good question. So what happens is, it was an auspicious moment for the terrorists, and they were seriously lucky because it was the day when India was playing England. There was a cricket match, so the shores were pretty much empty, so they could easily walk in. And at 9:40 in the night, that's 2100 hours and 40 minutes on 26 November 2008, they begin to open fire. And the first thing, they begin to open fire in 5 different locations, right? So when this happens, the first problem that we faced then was that the Mumbai police did not identify the nature of this threat. They thought that this was a pretty gang war. And
okay,
so when there's a difference between tackling a gang war and difference between tackling a terrorist attack. So we'll get to that later, but this is what happened initially. They went on a killing spree, and eventually they got into the Taj Mahal Hotel, the Nariman House, which is the Jewish Cultural Center, the Oberoi Hotel. They were at the Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminal, and Leopold Cafe and all these places. So they went
also
on
near Hotel Oberoi, right?
Yeah, yes, Hotel Oberoi as well. So all in all, totally they killed around 166 people and injuring a lot more. And the operations went on for 3 days when the energy came down. And finally, 9 of these terrorists were gunned down, and 1 terrorist was caught. Now, to speak about the significance of this terrorist being caught, if you have heard of Sun Tzu, the intelligence czar from China, he tells one thing: all warfare is based on deception. Now, if you take 26/11, for instance, that was also completely based on deception. Here you have a group that is coming from Pakistan, waging a war against India. It was an act of terrorism, but if you read the Pradhan Committee report, they use the word act of war at least 30 times. So it must be considered as war. So you have these chaps coming here, opening fire, and while the operations are going on, their handlers release a letter to the Indian media telling that this is being conducted by a group called Deccan Mujahideen. Okay?
And they operate out of Hyderabad, Deccan.
Yes. They apparently operated out of Hyderabad as Deccan Mujahideen. Not just that, these guys were all wearing saffron hand ribbons, which Hindus wear, which was procured from Siddhivinayak temple in Bombay. Which means, when you had all the 10 terrorists dead, you wouldn't know, who was involved in these operations. If you recollect, before 2008 Mumbai attacks, there were a few bomb blasts in Mumbai, in which you didn't know who the perpetrators were, whether it was Hindu extremists or whether it was the Lashkar-e-Taiba. So they wanted to create a scenario where the communal fault lines in India are aggravated and Hindus and Muslims get into conflict once more. So with the capture of Ajmal Kasab, all of these came out. So to put into context what happened in 26/11, there are three things that you need to understand. One is of the Pakistani deep state, which we have established. Second is that economic targets, they principally want to attack economic targets because that will have a crippling effect on India's image globally. And third thing is that the communal aspect in Indian society, which is seen as a major fault line, that is something time and again Pakistan has tried to exploit, and they will continue to exploit. So this threat perception still exists till today.
And further, if I may add, probably the attack worked far better than how the Pakistani state expected, right? Is that a fair statement to make? Or was this like a wild dream of theirs to have?
Or did they achieve all their objectives? Did they exceed expectations with some of their objectives, or did they fail them?
Both the 1993 attacks as well as the 2008 Mumbai attacks were, as a matter of fact, an experimental attack, to be honest. Because, like I said, in 1993, the final objective wasn't achieved. The assault did not happen. Even here, in 26/11, despite all the training and whatever they went through, the final objective of communal violence did not happen. And that did not happen because one of the main things that I did not want it to happen, the very fact that it was a Fidain operation, meant that they fought until death. But a man was captured. One Fidain was captured. That itself was a failure.
That's very interesting. And you mentioned Fidain earlier too. So Fidain means fighting till you die.
Yes.
And also this is something that we have seen more in the Middle East with Palestine and in Jerusalem and so on than it's been a feature in the Indian subcontinent, right?
Right, yeah. So the Pakistani state has been influenced by the developments in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for a long time. If you go back to the 90s when the Kashmiri insurgency was brewing and the Pakistanis were trying to persuade the local Kashmiris to rise up against the Indian state, what they're practically doing was they were trying to bring in the results of Intifada 1 and Intifada 2 in the Middle East.
What is the Intifada? Sorry?
The Intifada is where it is no more the Palestinian Liberation Organization or any other recognized terrorist group that was attacking the Israelis, but the people themselves started to rise up against them. That's when the stole pelting and all of that began. And so they wanted the Kashmiri population to replicate that. And around the same time, say early 2000s, that's when they conceived the idea of Fidain attacks. But the difference was that during that time, the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the ISI wanted to carry out Fidain attacks against hard military targets, not soft targets. The first such attack on soft targets came in 2002 when they attacked Akshardham in Gujarat.
Right.
Yeah, that was also an incident where NSG was called in. So that was for the first time then they did it. And after that, there was a long gap. And that is where, when we talk about institutional memory and all that, that is where it just faded from our memory. We did not know that, we forgot that something like this happened, and it could happen in Bombay as well.
Dheeraj, you told us a little bit about how Pakistan had these larger objectives they wanted to meet, and those were not met. One, Kasab was caught alive, and two, communal violence didn't flare up in Mumbai the way it might have, 2 or 3 decades earlier. How do you evaluate the Indian response to 26/11? I'm also seeing this as the first sort of major terrorist attack in India which had sort of live media coverage, and that's had its own problems.
Yes.
We know about several members of the National Security Group, the NSG, sort of dying while trying to capture these terrorists. There's a lot of finger pointing that's happened about the NSG, about the Mumbai police,
right.
Overall intelligence failure, a lot of these things. How do you really assess our response to this?
Well, speaking about the 26/11 attacks, one would have to approach the problem of 26/11 at 2 levels. Saying the first level is that of coastal security, and the second is of counterterrorism. Right? So, coastal security. Now, coastal security is a very big challenge in India. It's a very, very big challenge simply because we have a 7,000 odd kilometers coastline, and there are vast seas after that, and we've never taken it seriously. Right? So, one of the problems that we've had, a lot of changes have happened ever since 26/11 has happened. We have raised our technical platforms on the coastline. We've had the integrated underwater harbor defense surveillance systems. We've had automatic identification systems, and so many technical systems have come up. But the question is, can they achieve what they intend to achieve? And there I think that technical intelligence always has its limits. what you need is human intelligence. Now, technical intelligence, yes, for constant monitoring of the coast and all that, it is really good. Like, for instance, if you take the automatic identification systems, they identify the boats that come in and go out. But the point is, to identify, the boat has to have a transmitter where they can, communicate with each other. So all these, they have their own limitations. But speaking about human intelligence, now the problem here is that there are a lot of agencies operating. You have the Indian Navy and the Sagar Prahari Bal under the Indian Navy. You have the Indian Coast Guards. You have the Marine Police. And now the center wants to bring up something called the Central Marine Police Force, which is like the BSF. And I am personally not with the idea of having a Central Marine Police Force. So with so many agencies working to keep the coast secure, there is tend to be an overlapping. Not only an overlapping, there is a tendency of not being very serious, because one tends to think that the other guy is doing the job.
Yeah, there's always a free rider effect when you have so many bureaucracies that are working together with similar but different mandates.
Right, that's true. So with whatever investments has gone into this, the government has been spending hundreds of crores in securing a coastline and all that. But what I feel is that we lack what we call as maritime consciousness, and that is what is essential if we have to thwart not just seaborne terrorist attacks, but to just make sure that our coast is safe and we get every value possible from the natural resources around it. So what is maritime consciousness? This is something which has been in the literature for a long time, but seriousness of this is only understood recently after China has got aggressive in the South China Sea and other places. So since the 1980s, what the Chinese did was they introduced this concept of maritime consciousness in their own Mandarin parlance, just to make sure that the Chinese population, which was until then land-oriented, realizes the importance of the maritime domain. And what has happened over the last 20-30 years is that even now, even if the Chinese government suddenly wakes up one day and thinks that, look, we don't want to get into the South China Sea dispute anymore, let's just draw back and just sit in our cocoons, the Chinese population will not allow that to happen. Because here is a huge population that is completely aware of how important this region is to them, right? But we lack that kind of an understanding.
So there's this idea often with people who have distance from Delhi saying that there is so much overemphasis on our land borders,
right,
but none almost on our sea borders. Is that the idea of maritime consciousness?
Yeah, partly right. I mean, I don't want maritime consciousness to come at the cost of territorial consciousness. Both need to go hand in hand. But the point is, see, we have had a glorious past, in terms of maritime security. Long ago, we were one of, I think, the Kingdom of Travancore was one of the earliest to take on the Dutch and all that.
And even before that, you had the Cholas having an expeditionary force.
Right.
But yeah, it's this broad idea that, I mean, it's reflected in our forces, right? You look at the Indian Navy, it's the smallest of the three between the Army and the Air Force.
Exactly.
It's a travesty. In fact, General Prakash Menon, who works with us at Takshashila, he's a very rare infantryman who says we need a bigger navy. Right?
Okay.
We have a fairly infantry-dominated thinking on our military forces in India.
And
right?
that's also because our threats have traditionally focused on Pakistan. They focused on China, right? And we
want to fight China in the Himalayas, not in South China Sea.
Well,
the Bay of Bengal.
If you, from the position of strength, are deciding the theatre of operation, it's very well. But that's not the point. That's not how it's working here, right? So what happens is when you're talking about the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, it's not just about securing these maritime frontiers. We are also talking about the kind of opportunities we have there, right? So from the perspective of all of it, we need the public, and because in democracies, end of the day, it is public pressure which works. Why do you think Pakistan is always bought into our political narrative? Because it is politically lucrative, right? Now, we have to make the maritime domain politically lucrative. So when we as the Indian citizens, when the population begins to understand why the maritime domain is important, why we need to secure a coastline, and that kind of pressure reflects politically, that is when, see, for example, you had the idea of having a national maritime authority, and that's just been lying there in the limbo. Nobody is talking about it seriously. Why? And if I am a politician, even I wouldn't. Why would I? Because the people are not really serious about it. And what am I going to get by doing this? Literally nothing. So you may have some people who are, very high on national security. I'm a good example of that, talking about all this, but people don't take me seriously.
Right. So, and it's the same when it comes to trade, exports, other things. I mean, I have a friend who works in the shrimp export industry. Right. And the idea is when people talk about food processing and agriculture and sort of the food sector, people think farming.
Right.
Right? Not so much about aquaculture, about fishing and so on. That's secondary.
Right.
So I completely get your point. So this is about this marine orientation, which you highlight, which is very important.
The only time when we talk about the maritime domain or coastal security is when we have a conflict with Sri Lanka with the Tamil fishermen, getting and they cross waters in between each other.
Right. That's
the only time. So we can't always wait for a crisis to happen, right?
Absolutely. And so this is about maritime orientation and coastal security.
Right.
The second part, which I think is more interesting and maybe we'll spend more time on, is on counterintelligence, right?
So, counterterrorism.
Counterterrorism, yes.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
What is counterterrorism right at the beginning? It's just how to dismantle terrorism. Is it the same as anti-terrorism? What is it?
Well, yeah, that's a good distinction, and I would prefer the term anti-terrorist to be associated with me because counterterrorism includes a lot. It includes de-radicalization and XYZ, but I think right now we'll just stick to anti-terrorism. But yeah, counterterrorism will have a small part of it because since when we established the threat perception, I did speak about the communal violence part, which includes a significant part of it includes radicalization and de-radicalization. So there we do have counterterrorism as well. So being an academic who specializes in intelligence studies, it is my duty to let you all know that the very approach that we take to counterterrorism is quite wrong. We need to approach it not as an intelligence problem, but as a problem of counterintelligence, right? And the solution then lies in both defensive and offensive counterintelligence. Now it gets too academic, but I'll try to simplify it for you. So what exactly is counterintelligence? So counterintelligence, for a layman, what does a counterintelligence organization do? A counterintelligence organization tries to unearth foreign enemy spies within your own territory and disrupt whatever operations they are conducting here. Now, if you take any terrorist operation until the end of the operation, until you have a bomb blast or a Fidain attack commenced, it is an intelligence operation in progress. Continually, from the planning stage until then, it is an intelligence operation. So we, as Indians, if you have to thwart their attacks, if you have to disrupt their plans, we'll have to take a counterintelligence position. So what does counterintelligence entail? There are 4 different parts. One is counter-espionage, counter-subversion, counter-sabotage, and counter-deception. Okay. So I'll take each of them. Simplify it. Okay. So counter-espionage is self-explanatory. You have spies. Espionage is, gathering secret information which the hosts want to conceal. Okay. So, for example, take 26/11. You had David Coleman Headley visiting India. He had set up his offices here and he was going on a recce mission, capturing photographs and all that. But the IB did nothing about it.
This is the Intelligence Bureau.
Yeah, the Intelligence Bureau, which is India's premier counterintelligence agency. They did not act on it. And no intelligence operation can happen without local support. Okay? Far away from Mumbai, talk about Kashmir also, for example. Now, the Kashmir insurgency or the Kashmir militancy is sustaining simply because they have a level of local support who supply intelligence to them. So counter-espionage is to infiltrate these groups and try to see what kind of information is being sold to them, right? So
and do this legally with proper frameworks in a republic.
Yeah, see, when you're talking about counter-intelligence, it means that you're disrupting foreign intelligence plans. Right. It already means that there is a group which is working against your legal positions, okay? And to disrupt their plans, yes, you need a legal framework. I'm not disputing that, okay? But during the time, when you're looking at operations per se, I think legality has very little to do. It is only disruptive rather than facilitative.
I think Dheeraj is saying all is fair in love and war, and counterintelligence is war.
No, because
fair enough. That is an interesting debate for a later day. I mean, there's also, I think, a lawyer in Bangalore called Aditya Sondhi who's been working on how the very laws that have set up some of our intel and counterintelligence agencies have very questionable. So, which is again,
I don't deny it at all because
it's a different discussion.
Yeah, it's a different discussion. But if I can just say one sentence on this, these institutions are an inheritance from the colonial times, and nothing has changed since then. So, the institutions that were established to protect colonial interests, what more can you expect from them? So, whatever complaints you have against the legal aspect, I do agree with you. But as far as counterterrorism goes, I think we'll have to be very careful about what we're talking about because everything that we talk about, every legal aspect that we talk about may not be applicable in the counterterrorism part.
Definitely. And we are in the times of finally getting rid of Section 377. So when it comes to sort of going post-colonial on our counterintelligence laws, maybe the time will come, right?
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
So first part you said was
the
counter-espionage.
Okay, so infiltrated groups, and then you get your intelligence. Yeah, that's one part of it. The second aspect is counter-sabotage, for instance. Yeah. So sabotage is basically destroying of whatever instruments that you have, infrastructure, anything. That is the end goal of the terrorists. It may not be the end goal, but the end of the operation. That is to, for example, what did the 2611 attackers want to do? They wanted to attack Taj, they wanted to attack Nariman House and all that. So when you have a piece of information that that they're going to attack a particular set of infrastructure of yours, now a traditional intelligence system, the way it works, you will wait for the intelligence agency to tell you what kind of attack is going to take place. But in counterintelligence, because you're always anticipating an attack, you're always anticipating, you're waiting for the enemy forces to have their own intelligence operations. So you begin to think like the enemy. You begin to think critically and think of various possibilities that could happen. Right? So if I was a counterintelligence agent and I got an information telling that this building is going to be attacked, by virtue of my training, I will think of what are the possible ways that this building could be attacked. And that is what happened in 2611 was when they had a little bit of information, a little bit of intelligence that Taj was going to be attacked, they had all the bomb squad ready. But you didn't have terrorists who were interested in exploding bombs. They came with rifles and we were not ready for it. But a counter-sabotage guy would think of all the possibilities.
So we did have bomb squads ready at the Taj?
Yes, not just bomb squads. We had cops there, but the cops didn't really know why they were standing there. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that is a different discussion altogether because we talk about centralization and decentralization of authority. That we'll get to that a little later.
So we did have some intel. So from a counter-espionage point of view, it was not a complete failure. We had some signals coming in that something might happen.
Yes. So all this leads to one point that I want to make at the end, that intelligence has its limits in counterterrorism. And that is where we need to discuss about the response part. If you are thinking that intelligence can completely eradicate the problem of terrorism for us, then we are living in a fool's paradise. That's not going to happen. Right? So we spoke about counter-espionage and counter-sabotage.
Dheeraj, thank you. We've been talking about counter-espionage and we've just started talking about the response.
Counter-sabotage.
Counter-sabotage. And we'll talk more about that after this short break.
How aware do you think you are of your laws and rights? Do you look up to laws when you are caught up in situations? Do you know what your rights are when you're stuck somewhere bad? Well, here's a show that can help you move an inch closer to being aware of what your rights are. Tune into Know Your Qanoon with me, Amber Rana. This is a podcast meant to answer all your law-related queries. Catch Know Your Qanoon every week on the IVM website or the app or anywhere you get your podcast from.
Welcome back. Dheeraj, tell us more about the response that we had, the counter-sabotage part of what happened in 2611. So one part of it was perhaps the local police infrastructure. The other part was the NSG, right? Our elite anti-terrorism groups. Is that even a correct formulation?
No, I think you got me wrong here because the NSG is a responder. It doesn't figure here. We are talking about prevention right now. So at the prevention stage, it's only about intelligence operations. And there, my argument is that we need to take a counterintelligence role rather than an intelligence methodology of fighting terrorism.
Okay, so you have counter-espionage, counter-sabotage. What are the other two?
The third one is counter-subversion. Right? So like I said, the entire operation, though it was conceived in Pakistan, it was facilitated by some groups within India. Maybe not to the extent that the 1993 blast had, but yeah, you had some people like Abu Jundal and few other guys who had supported them. They worked in procuring those ID cards from Hyderabad, getting those saffron thread from Siddhivinayak temple and all of that. So it was an operation which had local support, albeit in a very limited fashion. So which means that within your population, there are people who are willing to support them. Which means it could be for several reasons. Okay, since we are talking about the western coastline, right? And we are sitting here in a state today who's recently had the state elections. And if you've noticed the entire campaigning, half of it was done on Hindu-Muslim,
lines.
Yeah. So when there's so much of disharmony existing, there's always room for so much of hatred to, show up in some form of extremism or terrorism, right? So counter-subversion is you infiltrate groups. The very word infiltrate may seem wrong, and I think that is what provoked you to ask the question then. It's not just infiltrating. See, counter-terrorism is essentially, it should be seen as a policing and law enforcement duty, not a military duty, you know. So when you say policing duty, right, you see cops around you every time. It's not that they're threatening you. It's not that they're here to intervene in your life. It is to make sure that nothing wrong happens. All right. And so you see, there is, you're traveling on the road, you see two cars meet with an accident, and immediately the cop comes there. He comes there because he wants to make sure that the two guys don't start fighting with each other, right?
You want to de-escalate situations as much as possible in any scenario.
Right. And keep the threat perception as low as possible, right? So in counter-subversion, you infiltrate groups, you get into groups which are communally charged and all that, and see how the emotions are working out. And that will give you a fair idea of if there is a possibility of a terrorist attack going to happen. Okay,
and now diffuse emotions where you can.
Yes, exactly. Okay, and you shouldn't look at it in isolation. Okay, you should look at counter-subversion alongside counter-sabotage and counter-espionage. And the last point is deception. What does deception mean? I mean, deception is actually planting misinformation so as to misguide your enemy. Right, that's what happens. So throughout the First World War, Second World War, any war you take, for example, military leadership has always been involved in deception. This happens more so when you want to save your resources and take the enemy by surprise, right? Now, in counterintelligence, deception plays a very important role because you don't want the enemy to know what you know about him, right? So that is where you have planting of your sources and all that, and then you keep sending misinformation. In fact, deception had a reverse role in 2611. When the boat set sail from Karachi port, right, our security forces, they were busy looking in the Sir Creek area in Gujarat. This is because Dawood's gang had sent a misinformation that there are terrorists or there are smugglers over there. And we were looking for everything over there while these people safe and secure.
India-Pakistan land and coastal border in Gujarat, right? Near Kutch.
Yes. It's called the bastard Chano Harami Nala. So that's what it's called. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, because it keeps changing its trajectory.
Okay.
Yeah, so it sometimes goes into the Pakistan has a lot of the territory, while we have more of it. So what happens is the poor fishermen who go to fish, right? They don't really know whose waters they've entered, and that's why they call it the bastard channel, because there's no clear clarity of who you belong to. Right?
Wow. Today I learned moment.
Yes, absolutely. Right. So there was misinformation from Dawood Ibrahim and others in Pakistan telling us that, hey, something might be happening there.
Right.
Whereas the real stuff was going down near Mumbai.
Yeah.
All right.
So in counterintelligence operations, this may again seem cynical, but this is how it works. Deception works this way, that you make the terrorists believe that everything is going as per their plan. And in the final moment, you apprehend them.
Okay.
You
don't catch them too early, otherwise they'll run away. Or
yes, because a terrorist attack is just one of the entire larger strategic plan that they have. Because terrorism is only means to something that they want to achieve, right? So you may thwart one terrorist attack, but something larger might be brewing. For all you know, like I said, deception works on the other side also, right? So they may send a small group to deliberately get caught so that they know how we respond to all these things.
Okay,
so it's a continuous thing, right? So it's like this, man. So if you want me to explain in simple words the difference between warning intelligence and counterintelligence. 10 years ago, when everything was good in Bangalore, you had 3 months of all seasons, right? You had 3 months of summer, followed by 3 months of spring, and then followed by winter, in whatever order, right? So the point is, when you know exactly what is going to happen, right, the probability of it raining during the summer is very, very low. But imagine you're all out there enjoying, having fun, traffic jams and all that, and suddenly it starts to rain, right? You're all wet, there's traffic commotion and all that. So the probability of it raining was low, but the impact is very high, right? But imagine you're in England, where it rains every other day. Right?
You know how to handle it.
The probability is very, very high that it'll rain, but when it rains, the impact is very low as long as you've forgotten the umbrella or something like that, right? So in counterintelligence works on this paradigm, that when we look at the role of counterintelligence in counterterrorism, what we essentially are looking for is high probability and low impact scenarios, where there's a high probability that terrorists will launch an attack, but the impact should always be low, right?
Okay.
So that is why I argue that when you talk about seaborne terrorist attacks, right, cut down on the number of institutions that you have, all these marine police, XYZ and all that. Make IB is the premier Indian agency which takes care of counterterrorism, but that I don't think they thought through all this. It is one of the primary reason for doing this is simply because IB is considered to have internal security roles, and we consider terrorism to be an internal security problem.
Okay. All right. So I want to go back to your assessment that generally terrorist attacks are high probability, low impact, and
yeah.
that's the counterintelligence view of it,
Yeah.
right? So let's talk about response. What happened, at least in the Mumbai terror attacks, is that there was a lot of criticism that the Mumbai police didn't know what they were dealing with. Then the NSG came, and after 3 days of, I think, siege or whatever the media called it at that point of time of the Taj Hotel, 9 terrorists were shot and 1 was reprehended, right?
Right.
So how do we rate that response?
Right. Well, in all honesty, we need to blame the Mumbai police and the NSG for a lot of things. But when we take 26/11 into consideration, that the very fact that you're telling that they were criticized, we need to think about where the criticism came from.
Okay.
The criticism by and large came from the West. It was the Western politicians and the Western media which kept on criticizing Indian counter-terrorist responses. It was partly because they wanted to evade putting the blame on Pakistan for having carried out such an attack, even though we had real-time intelligence of their handlers talking with the terrorists. Right? Now this happened, but there were honest Western academicians who specialize in the role of tactics in counter-terrorist operations, and they very clearly explicitly expressed that no police force in the world was equipped to take on something like this. This was a deadly attack, but the first of its kind to be ever seen in the planet. Some people do say that in 1975 you had the Savoy attack in Israel, where it was seaborne and things like that. But the kind of sophistry that the 26/11 attacks had was unprecedented. Even to go ahead, after 26/11, you had attacks across Europe. For instance, you had the November Paris attacks in 2015, all of these. And again, you have experts commenting that these are Mumbai-style attacks. Some tactics may be similar to what happened in Mumbai. But overall, the very fact that they lacked state sponsorship, that they lacked this special forces training and all that, gives me an impression that none of these qualify as a terrorist attack that can be analogous with the 26/11 attacks.
Okay. I agree with you that a lot of Western countries may have a bias in putting forward stringent criticisms of what the response that we had. But as Indians, if we're looking at it, we can say that yes, there were a lot of things that the Mumbai police and the NSG did right. But I also want to know what were the gaps. Or how should we be looking at gaps?
Let me first establish the problem well, so that we understand where the problems lie and what needs to be fixed, all right? So if you look at terrorism per se in the world, terrorism reached its peak during the 70s. That's when the Palestinian liberation organizations were active across the globe. You saw the Munich attack in 1972. And the Munich attack in 1972 is what revolutionized policing.
Yeah.
In India, police have an aversion to the use of force. When I say use of force, they are lathi wielding. They may freak out the common populace, but they are not arms wielding police forces. All right.
In fact, armed police in India are lower in the pecking order.
That's right.
In terms of prestige and so on than your traffic cops, right?
Right.
Whose prestige is very high because the ability to extract rent from the population is the highest.
You'll have to ask the police regarding this. I don't want to comment on that. Yeah.
I will not put those words in your mouth.
Right. Yeah, what I was telling was, even where we have armed police, these are only in insurgency prone areas. It is not in big cities like Bangalore, Mumbai, Delhi and XYZ. It is only a post 26/11 phenomena that you have SWAT units and Force One and all those things coming up, right? So when in 1972, when the Munich attack happened, that is when it showed the glaring deficiencies in the German police. And what happened as a result was the birth of GSG-9, that's Grenzschutzgruppe 9, which is the elite counter-terrorist SWAT unit in the German police, right? At the same time, around the same time, what is happening in the United States was there were gang wars, all of which involved assault weapons and all of that. So the Los Angeles Police Department, they experimented with something called SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics. It was initially called Special Weapons Attack Tactics, and then eventually it became Special Weapons and Tactics. So they wanted to militarize the police to an extent where they can take on these guys who are, gun-wielding criminals, basically, not really terrorists. So that is happening in North America, and in Europe and Asia, where terrorism was brewing, you had incidents of hostage-taking and flight hijacking, right? So in both these instances, what happened was, you had terrorists who would take hostages All right. The end goal was to negotiate and have the demands met by the governments. That used to always happen. Even until 1999, the hijacking of the Indian aircraft, you've always had hijackers putting forth the demands and the governments either meeting them or whatever. Mostly the demands were political, or the release of terrorists, or ransom or something like that. Right?
And IC-814 was another example of that.
Yeah, that is the 99 example that I was referring to. Right. So here what happens is, these terrorist groups, though they are politically motivated and they are willing to give up their lives for the political causes, they would always prefer to live, right? They said, yes, we are willing to die, and that's why we are here, But then, if our demands are met, we are willing to, give away your hostages, and we are going to get out of here, right? So when you have this sort of a threat perception, so what units were meant to do is, like, we'll take the example of United States. They had a negotiator within the SWAT team who was trained by the FBI in negotiating skills, and they had the operatives who were trained by the military to an extent, okay, in handling these special weapons. So the role of the negotiator was to buy as much time as possible. Okay, so here the negotiator sits and he keeps negotiating with the terrorists inside or the hijackers inside, and he has to buy as much time as possible, while the actual SWAT operatives, right, they keep rehearsing on how to infiltrate the building and get the hostages out safely.
So
right?
they're sort of gathering tactical intelligence. Okay, what
Yes.
things are open, how many people are there,
Right.
what can we do, what weapons they have. They're doing all of that while the negotiators just
Yeah,
talking
they're
to
doing
them.
all of that, and they're also rehearsing, because they need to know how to get in and how to get out, right? So they're rehearsing, right? Which means the time factor is always on the SWAT side. No, it's not on the terrorist side. And the role of the negotiator is more important here, because he's trying to tire out the terrorists, because very soon combat stress, fatigue, all this sets in, and beyond which the terrorists will not know what to do. They either give up or they begin killing the terrorists. That's when these guys go in and begin to operate or whatever. And it's very rare that the terrorists used to kill the hostages, right? So what happens in this format is that the negotiator is the key man, while the troops who are practicing, who are rehearsing the whole operation, right, they are only playing a supportive role. Okay. So what happened in 9/11? The 9/11 attacks became another revolution in terrorist affairs, simply because until then they're not seen something of like a kamikaze style, getting into buildings and all that. Now, why did this happen? For all the, we need to give due credit to the terrorists as well. They are intellectuals. Mind you, they are intellectuals. Because during the 90s, the Algerian terrorists had wanted to do the same thing with taking the flight and hitting it into the Paris Eiffel Tower. Yeah. But what happened was, they kept negotiating, and then finally, the pilot, he used his presence of mind and he said, look, we are running out of fuel, we just need to land here, we'll refuel and then we'll take off. And in that small window of opportunity that they got, the French GIGN, which is the NSG's counterpart there in France, they carried out an operation and they were neutralized. And the Al-Qaeda terrorists, they remembered this. And they said, look, if we give any opportunity for people to, negotiate, then the advantage is on their court now. We don't have anything to do. So they said, we are going to have a bunch of stupid guys who will only learn how to take off a flight, but will not learn how to land the flight. Right? And in all Fidain operations, you need to understand the guys who finally get selected to become the Fidains, right? They are highly stupid, because it's very easy to motivate and radicalize a stupid person. If he can think for himself, that is a big problem for the terrorist leaders. He has to be physically strong, but mentally, he just has to be somebody who's a yes sir kind of guy.
So, at one level, you're saying terrorists are intellectuals. You'll get a lot of hate for that. By the way.
It's all right.
But
what is it to say? Know thy enemy, know thyself, and you'll win.
I get your point.
Battles,
There are people who are smart at controlling
right.
others, who might be misguided, who might be easily persuaded, who might, be the faithful who will give up their lives for a noble cause, kill other people for what they think is a noble cause, right?
Exactly.
So you need to be a certain level of motivated, and also at a certain level not be sufficiently questioning.
Exactly.
And that can be coming from a complex set of social factors, right? I mean, they might be deprived in some way. You might stoke their fears. A lot might happen.
Yes,
and that's a separate discussion.
That's a separate discussion, but just to say that is one of the reasons today terrorist structures have become increasingly hierarchical. And the organization structures are in place in such a way that infiltration becomes very, very difficult. And one of the reasons is what you said now, but we can discuss it some other time and not today. Okay, so coming back to what we were talking about. So in all these instances where you see that the terrorists were willing to negotiate, the advantage was always with the SWAT units, and finally the terrorists lost it out. They literally could get nothing. So now the Pakistani SSG that I was talking about, that their special forces, they realized that, look, this is how the counter-terrorist forces across the world are going to react. And so we need to train a set of guys who can just go on a killing spree where there's no time for negotiations and all that. So these SWAT units, they functioned on the assumption that the terrorists were willing to negotiate. So they had formulated a tactic called as CCN. That's control, contain and negotiate. Right? So you control the threat. So you see, if you've seen in Hollywood movies, suddenly you have the cops coming in, barricading, sending all the people away, censoring the press and all that. That's controlling, and then you contain the threat to a level as much as possible. That's when the negotiator begins to talk, communicate with the terrorist. And then the negotiation part, if it doesn't go well, then you have the operations part happening.
And you neutralize.
Yeah, and you neutralize it. Right. So what happened in this model is that the control part itself used to take more than an hour. Right, you had nearly some 90 minutes to 1 hour, 45 minutes for people to be contained, because you had all the emergency services coming in and all that. Right?
And it was difficult to contain because it was happening simultaneously in so many places.
Exactly.
And it was supposed to spread to other places that we don't. The 5 places that you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, for example, was not the only places where these terrorists were supposed to strike. So just the fact that they struck these places alone meant that this is where these attacks were contained. Right?
So you're talking about how 2611 was different from the previous thing. So we'll first explain to the listeners what the first part, right? So what happens when you spend hours together in controlling itself, and that is what happened in 2611. When that happened, immediately you had lathi-wielding policemen coming, and they were trained in crowd controlling and not anything more, right? So they're trying to do that. But what happens in these swarming attacks, right? Where swarming attacks are where you come like bees and you swarm, and then you just begin your operations. So in 5 different locations, these 10 terrorists operated in buddy pairs. Now, working in buddy pairs is a hallmark of special forces operation. For example, if you take the death of Sandeep Unnikrishnan on 2611, he was operating with his buddy, and his buddy was injured badly, and so he had to send him off to safety, make sure that he's being given medical aid, and then he went all by himself. He went chasing the terrorists. I think this was in Taj, if I'm not wrong. I may be wrong on this. And then he was shot there, right? So working in buddy pair is a hallmark of a special forces commando, and along with many other things. Okay, so this kind of a swarming attack, when it happens, so during 2611, what had happened was, by the end of the 3 days siege, right, there were 166 people, by some accounts 170, 180 people dead, and more than 100 of them were killed in the first 1 hour or so.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So because they went on opening fire on the public, right? So when you have to stop this, you cannot work under the assumption that these terrorists are willing to negotiate, right?
You can't spend the first 90 minutes just doing containment.
Right, yes, that happens. So we talked about the role of time as well here. The time, initially when you were negotiating with the terrorists, you had time to rehearse your operations, which means time was also on your ground. Now the time has shifted onto the terrorist ground because they are just going on a killing spree. Time is a luxury for you now. You can't afford to have it. You need to go and tackle them eliminate them as quickly as possible. So there are multiple factors now which have completely shifted onto the terrorist side. Now the final thing is that we need to understand with regards to the change in the nature of terrorist attacks is the role of the hostage. Okay. Initially, when you spoke about the SWAT operations and the control, contain and negotiate strategy, the role of the hostage was that he or she who was taken as a hostage was working as a bargaining chip, right? So you're here, you're holding your hostages and you're negotiating with the government. Okay. But now, since you're here to kill as many as possible, you're using hostages not as bargaining chips, but as human shield. Right?
So because the nature of the game is different.
It's completely changed. And that is what made the operation to extend from day 1 till day 3. People criticized that the NSG took 12 hours to come, right, from Delhi to Mumbai. Now, it was a cross-country operation. They had to come from Manesar all the way to Mumbai, and there was this whole traffic jam and all that. So these are things that can be solved. They need to be rectified. But to say that simply because NSG took so much time to come here, I think that is quite ridiculous. Because even as late as 2015, when the Paris attacks happened, the GIGN, which is based in Paris itself, it took 2.5 hours to come, right? And in 1980, when the Iranian embassy was attacked in London, the British essays took 16 hours to come, by which time 150 hours was lost, right? So this is not to say that this is not to justify what happened then, but all I'm saying is that couldn't have, made any significant impact on Indian counterterrorism on that particular day, right? And what happened after they came? Since I told that the NSG is modeled on the GSG9 and GIGN and all this, they also work on the same paradigm that, we are here to rescue people. So when they began operating, their goal was not to eliminate the terrorists, but the goal was to save as many number of people as possible. And that is why when people tell me that 166 people were killed and Indian counterterrorism failed, you need to understand the NSG and the Marcos together, they saved over 800 people who were locked up in those hotel rooms. And these NSG commandos did not have any idea about what these buildings look like. So if you visit Manesar anytime, or any of these commando units across the world until 2008 Mumbai attacks happened, you had these commandos training in dummy aircrafts or a single building and things like that. They never anticipated such huge buildings, simply because it was, if you think from that paradigm, right, the paradigm of control, contain and negotiate, it is simply stupid for me as a terrorist to enter a mall or a building like Taj Mahal with so many multiple entries into it. There's no time to negotiate because people will enter from anywhere and then they'll bump me off, right? But now they had taken such huge buildings and there's no intelligence about it at all. So the only way they could get intelligence was from the police who had engaged the terrorists until then. They had no clue either, and they did not have the layout of the buildings and all this. So what they had to do was, the role of snipers from then to now remained the same. The only role that the snipers had, in very rare cases did they actually snipe. The main role was to act as a surveillance unit, to observe and report. And now, since they did not know what is happening inside, the snipers had to play that role.
Okay.
Right?
And even that was limited. Yes,
very limited, very limited. So between them, the Marcos and the NSG saved around 800 people, and only then did they go. In fact, when Sandeep Unnikrishnan was gunned down, the chief of the NSG did contemplate, just stopping the operations there and moving elsewhere, because the death of NSG commandos would have a drastic impact on the morale of the forces, right? They had the luxury to take such a decision, although they did not. They could take such a decision because they're working to save hostages and not kill terrorists. And saving hostages part was taken care of, right? So today, when I say we need a paradigm shift, we need a shift in policing. It's all right to have NSG regional hubs everywhere, but that's not going to solve the problem. The NSG has serious drawbacks, which we can talk about eventually. But the point is that the police first responder must be able to, move in the direction of fire, take on the terrorists. So a swarming attack needs to be met with a swarming response. Okay, so here is a group that wants to just, go on firing and move as far as possible. You limit their movement. Okay, so that's how you judge the success of counterterrorism. So tomorrow, if a Fidayeen attack happens, worst case scenario, right? All our intelligence inputs have fallen on deaf ears. Everything has failed. So there is an attack. If you can make sure that these guys have come equipped to say launch a long-held war for some 3-4 days, but they end up killing only say 10 or 11 people by when this is what happened in Gurdaspur, right? So that needs to be regarded as counter-terrorist success.
Okay, on the notes of a paradigm shift, let's take a small break here.
Did you know that Parsis in Mumbai, instead of being left at the Tower of Silence after they die, are now cremated? And why? Because a cow fell sick in the early 1990s. Did you know that the smog in Delhi is caused by something that farmers in Punjab do, and that there's no way to stop them? Did you know that there wasn't one gas tragedy in Bhopal, but 3? One of them was seen, but 2 were unseen. Did you know that many well-intentioned government policies hurt the people they're supposed to help? Why was demonetization a bad idea? How should GST have been implemented? Why are all our politicians so corrupt when not all of them are bad people? I'm Amit Verma, and in my weekly podcast, The Seen and the Unseen, I take a shot at answering all these questions and many more. I aim to go beyond the seen and show you the unseen effects of public policy and private action. I speak to experts on economics, political philosophy, cognitive neuroscience, and constitutional law so that their insights can blow not only my mind, but also yours. The Seen and the Unseen releases every Monday. So do check out the archives and follow the show at seenunseen.in. You can also subscribe to the seen and the unseen on whatever podcast app you happen to prefer.
Welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. We're sitting here with Dheeraj talking about the 26/11 attacks. So, Dheeraj, you were talking about how there's fundamentally a paradigm shift that's taking place with 26/11, right? This is a terrorist attack that's very, very different from any other terrorist attack that's happened in modern history simply because it's state-sponsored. They have a lot of backing from people who know counterterrorism, and we spoke about control, contain, negotiate, and how that paradigm didn't really work in 26/11. Right? Tell us more. Tell us about the responders, because there's been a lot of talk about the NSG, right? So how did they fare?
Okay, so the primary role of the NSG was to save as many hostages as possible. It was not eliminating the terrorists. That was only eventually, right? And they did fare really well in that because they had to go around checking 1,500 rooms individually, and every time they went to a room, it's quite obvious that the occupant of the room wouldn't open the door because he's under the fear of not knowing who's on the other side of the door. So they did that. They carried out the operation very well. They saved more than 800 people, and all that was done. But today, when we sit here 10 years after 26/11, we need to look at some of the areas that really needed improvement in the NSG, right? Now, you'll have people talking about equipment, the weapons and all that, and those are all given. They have to change, but we are a poor country and we lack interest in all this. The funding is always a problem and all that. But fundamentally, there is a problem with the NSG. I said the NSG was based on the GSG-9 and also of the France GIGN. But both the foreign organizations are under their home ministry. Now, we in India, the NSG comprises of Special Action Group and a Special Rangers Group. Okay, so two groups. But the composition is made of Central Armed Police Forces as well as the personnel from the armed forces.
So it's paramilitary forces and military
forces.
Yes,
it's both of them, right? It's under the MHA, but the decision-making authority is also, again, it's not clear-cut out, you know. So there is an overlapping between the two.
So you're saying the NSG comes under our Ministry of Home Affairs,
yes,
but it's made up of paramilitary and military people,
yes,
and we don't know who's calling the shots. Is
right,
that right?
Right. It's not about not knowing who calls the shot, because there's always a designation there. But the point is, you can't expect people to cooperate. Like, for instance, the intelligence officer who was there, the officer who had the role of gathering intelligence on that particular day, he was somebody, I think he was a CISF officer, that is Central Industrial Security Force officer, with no experience at all in intelligence. Right? So these are some of the glaring deficiencies that NSG has. So today, you may have hubs across the country, but if you're having people who come on deputation from one department to the NSG, you don't really have any institutional memory. So
people come from various forces
2-3 years and then they go.
Years.
They just go back.
So they don't grow in the NSG.
Yes, there is nothing called an NSG cadre, for instance. You know,
okay.
So if you want the NSG to be an elite force, that is what you're meant to do. You're supposed to train day in and day out to conduct these kind of operations. You rehearse for it. I mean, so that is what, you know. It has to flow from the political level. So they need to task this particular group to conduct these kind of operations. After they task them, intelligence, weapon training and everything has to go in that format. And eventually these commandos, the black cats, need to know that, look, we are here to do this job. We don't have to go back to elsewhere after this. But as long as you have people coming on deputation, there is seriously going to be a problem. So all those chaps who were there, who in 2016, who fought so bravely in 26/11, who saw firsthand what the kind of problems they faced, they're all gone back to their parent cadres. I don't know what they're doing today. They're no more there in the NSG. So as long as things like this don't change. So to wind up, if I had to tell two things: one, the NSG has to undergo this they have to rectify this organizational flaw, and our first responders need to grow. The first one was created by the Mumbai police, and Delhi police now they have their own SWAT unit. The Punjab police has. I don't think Bangalore police and all of these have any SWAT units. So we need to get all these so-called sensitive locations or big cities. They need to get SWAT units. But again, like I said, their working assumptions need to change. They can't work on the assumption that they're going to be hostages and we can negotiate. Terrorists in the future who come from Pakistan, they're not here to negotiate. They're here to negotiate in a different way. Their negotiation happens, the whole act of terrorism is them negotiating with you, letting you know that, look, we are not here to listen to you, you better listen to us. So to counter this kind of a threat, our first responders need to be active, and the SWAT needs to undergo an organizational change. Yeah.
Dheeraj, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you here 10 years after 26/11 and to talk about how to truly understand what happened then. And it is truly sad that even 10 years later, not enough people know about what happened, why it happened, how it happened, and what are the real lessons to be learned. So thank you for helping us in that journey.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
That brings us to the end of today's podcast. You can also read more of Dheeraj's writing on intelligence on the Pragati site, which is www.thinkpragati.com. I also have some personal news, as I'd mentioned at the start. This will be my last episode hosting the Pragati Podcast. When we began the show, I did not know what we were undertaking, doing this week after week. But the Pragati Podcast has grown to a show that people know and appreciate, and I'm grateful to have been part of it. I'm particularly grateful to people who tune in every Thursday just to listen to us. But this doesn't mean the end of my journey with audio. You will hopefully hear more from me in the coming weeks and months. If not on this show, then a new one. So on that note, thank you for listening to the Pragati Podcast. You can listen to the Pragati Podcast on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts from. Pavan Srinath will be back next week with your Policy Fix.
Do you have a night routine? Well, everyone has one. And the to-do list usually looks like this. Brush your teeth, set that alarm, get into your pajamas, and switch off those screens. But here's one more to add to that list. Tune into the Positively Unlimited podcast for a dose of positive action and tips on how to build powerful mindsets. Episodes out every Monday on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you tune into podcasts.
Have you gotten yourself a gym membership and shown up only a few times? Are long working hours cutting your fitness goals short? How about you change things a little? Even a small effort can make a big difference. And I'll tell you how and what exactly. Hi guys, I'm Coach Urmi, and on the Kinetic Living podcast, you can look forward to some interesting stories of people who have changed the way they look at fitness after their kinetic journeys. Episodes out every Wednesday on the IVM app, website, and anywhere you get your podcast from.